Can you imagine a black teenager with no legal training challenging a seasoned attorney and a hard-nosed judge and holding his own? Stick around to witness this powerful journey, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. Now let's dive into the emotional fight for justice led by 17-year-old Jordan Carter. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs and the occasional rustle of paper. Cold, sterile lights bounced off the polished wooden benches, casting sharp shadows on the faces of those present. Every seat was filled, every eye focused forward. A battle was about to begin. At the front of the room sat Judge Reynolds, known for his unforgiving rulings and piercing stare. His reputation was one of strict adherence to the law, with little patience for anything or anyone that didn't meet his standards. He swept his gaze across the courtroom, his face as stern as the gavel resting in his hand. Then the heavy courtroom doors creaked open, and the whispers faded to silence. All heads turned. A teenager entered. Jordan Carter, black 17, and wearing an oversized blazer, clutched a worn-out briefcase in one hand. His sneakers squeaked quietly against the floor as he walked to the defense table. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, not just in surprise, but in thinly veiled judgment. "What's he doing here?" someone whispered. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow, a smug smile creeping onto his face. "This isn't the gymnasium," he said dryly. "Are you sure you're not lost on your way to basketball practice?" The courtroom chuckled, led by Franklin Moore, the opposing attorney, whose smirk radiated condescension. But Jordan didn't flinch. He straightened his back, looked the judge in the eye, and spoke clearly. "No, Your Honor. I'm here to defend my mother." Silence fell like a curtain. For a moment, time stood still. But to understand how this teenager ended up standing alone in court, you need to go back to where this story began. Jordan Carter lived with his mother, Angela, in a neighborhood that the world had seemingly left behind. Cracked sidewalks, weathered houses leaning tiredly into one another. It was a place where hope felt like a luxury. Angela, a single mother, worked tirelessly as a cleaner. She took on every shift she could find just to keep food on the table and the rent barely paid. Despite everything, she made their small, run-down house a home. Peeling paint and leaky pipes couldn't drown out the warmth and laughter she filled it with. Every night, she reminded Jordan, education was his ticket out. One scorching afternoon, Angela came home after a grueling shift to find a folded paper shoved under the door. She wiped sweat from her brow, unfolded it, and her face fell. It was an eviction notice. "They're saying I owe back rent," she murmured, her voice trembling. "But I've paid. I know I've paid." Jordan looked up from his school books at the kitchen table. He saw her face and knew something was wrong. He grabbed the paper and read it carefully, his brow furrowed. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "Something's not right here." Angela sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "You don't understand, Jordan," she whispered. "People like us, we don't win. No matter what we do, they always find a way to take everything." For the first time, Jordan saw the strongest person he knew, his mother, defeated. Her resignation wasn't just fear, it was lived experience. But to Jordan, her words weren't an ending. They were a spark. He gripped the eviction notice tighter. If no one else would fight for them, he would. That night, the image of his mother sitting in silence haunted him. He couldn't sleep. He walked over, sat beside her on the couch, and gently said, "Mom, you've done everything for me. Let me do something for you." Angela shook her head, worn down by life and reality. "Jordan, you're just a boy," she said. "They've got lawyers, power. We can't fight them." "But what if we can?" Jordan's voice was trembling, but firm. "What if they're wrong?" Angela's eyes welled with tears. "Even if we had a lawyer, it wouldn't matter. People like the landlord, they always win." Jordan leaned forward. "We can't afford a lawyer, I know. But what if I represent you?" Angela stared at him, stunned. "That's impossible, Jordan. You don't know the law." "I can learn," he said, voice steady now. "You taught me to work hard, to never give up. I have to try." There was a long silence, only the hum of the old fridge in the background. Angela looked at her son, seeing something in him she thought had long been buried. Strength, hope. She reached for his hand, her voice barely a whisper. If you believe you can do this, I'll stand with you. Always. That night, while his mother slept, Jordan opened his old laptop. He searched tenant rights, eviction laws, legal defense strategies. The words were foreign, the legal language overwhelming, but his heart was locked on one goal: protect his mother, save their home. In the days that followed, Jordan lived at the kitchen table, now covered with borrowed law books, printed case files, and his own meticulous notes. He barely slept. He barely ate, but he never stopped studying. Angela often watched him from the doorway, a quiet mix of pride and worry in her eyes. Her son, a child in the eyes of the world, was preparing to face a courtroom built to break people like them. And he had no intention of backing down. Angela Carter could only watch in silence as her son waged a quiet war from the kitchen table. Night after night, Jordan buried himself in legal documents, eyes strained, posture slouched, his body giving in to exhaustion, but not his spirit. He pressed on, unyielding. Angela stood in the doorway one evening, lingering longer than usual. Her gaze softened as it rested on him. Finally she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Jordan, you don't have to do this alone. You've already done more than I could have ever asked." Jordan looked up slowly. His eyes were bloodshot, his face weary, but in them was something unbreakable. "Mom," he said, "if I don't, who will? They're counting on us to give up, but we're not giving up, not this time." Late one night, Jordan flipped through a dense housing rights manual, highlighter in hand, when a single sentence made his breath hitch. All eviction notices must be notarized by a valid, practicing notary public to be legally enforceable. His heart skipped. He jumped up, grabbed the eviction notice tacked to the wall, and scanned the bottom. A notary signature. But something about it didn't feel right. He sat back down, hands trembling, and typed the notary's name into his laptop. An hour passed. Then he found it. The notary listed had retired 2 years before the eviction notice was issued. Jordan's eyes widened. This wasn't just a clerical error. It was fraud. Plain and simple. Adrenaline surged through his veins, replacing weeks of fatigue. He sat back, staring at the paper in disbelief. This could be their way out, their lifeline. But it also meant something else. The fight ahead would be even harder. The landlord's lawyer would come at him with everything. Jordan couldn't afford to slip, not once. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Jordan transformed the small living room into a mock courtroom. He stood in front of a cracked mirror, binder in hand, rehearsing his statements, predicting counter-arguments, and drilling every point into memory. His voice, once unsure, grew firmer. His words, once clumsy, became sharp and deliberate. Angela often peeked in from the hallway. Sometimes she'd watch in silence, a small smile tugging at her lips. One evening she walked over and gently sat beside him. Her hand rested on his. Her voice shook. "No matter what happens," she said, "I want you to know, I'm proud of you. You've already done more than I ever imagined possible." Jordan turned to her, his eyes soft. "I'm not just doing this for us, Mom. If they get away with it, they'll do it to someone else. I can't let that happen." The night before the hearing, the kitchen table was buried in neatly stacked papers, notes, and highlighted statutes. Jordan's oversized blazer, borrowed from a neighbor, hung on the back of his chair. Angela quietly entered the room, placing a warm plate of food beside him. "You need to eat," she said gently. He looked up and gave her a tired smile. "Thanks, Mom." But the plate stayed untouched. He turned back to his notes, scanning each page like it held the answer to everything. Angela watched from the doorway, her heart full of both pride and dread. She knew the odds were against them. Still, for the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred. "Get some rest," she whispered. "You've done everything you can." Jordan didn't look up. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Just a little more." The next morning, Jordan stood on the courthouse steps, clutching his binder with both hands. His blazer didn't fit quite right. It hung off his shoulders like armor borrowed from a soldier. But the fire in his eyes fit perfectly. It was time. Inside the courtroom, a hush fell as Jordan took his place at the defense table. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavy on his chest. but he stood tall. He looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear, "I'm here to prove that my family's eviction was not only unjust, but unlawful. I will show that the landlord knowingly used a fraudulent notice, causing harm that could have been avoided." Judge Reynolds arched an eyebrow. His face remained unreadable, but he leaned in, intrigued. From across the courtroom, Franklin Moore, the landlord's attorney, chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "Well, this is something," he said loudly. "Tell me, son, did you learn this from a YouTube tutorial? Or was it one of those how to be a lawyer in 5 steps videos?" Scattered laughter rippled through the gallery, but Jordan didn't react. He took a slow breath, met Moore's mocking stare, and responded, "No, I learned this from the same laws that are supposed to protect everyone, and if the court allows me, I'll show exactly how those laws were broken." Moore's smirk faltered. Judge Reynolds tapped his pen against the desk. "Proceed," he said. Jordan opened his binder. His fingers no longer trembled. With calm precision, he laid out the timeline. Every missed receipt, every unverified claim. He explained how the eviction notice failed legal standards. And then he reached the final piece. "This is the notice posted on our door," he said, holding it up. "It includes a notary signature, but the notary listed—" He paused, letting the room hang in silence. "Retired 2 years before this was signed. I have the public records to prove it." The courtroom went still. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he studied the document. The murmurs returned, but softer now, less skeptical, more curious, more respectful. Jordan had come with facts, with fire, with the truth. And for the first time since it all began, the system was forced to listen. But Jordan knew one discovery wouldn't be enough, not unless he could build a case around it strong enough to stand up to scrutiny. That realization lit a fire inside him. The hours that followed were relentless. He pored over statutes, read court rulings deep into the night, and outlined arguments until his fingers ached. Later that evening, Angela entered the kitchen. She paused quietly in the doorway, watching her son scribble furiously into his binder, pages scattered across the table. With a tenderness born of both pride and worry, she stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jordan," she said softly, "I'm proud of you, but you don't have to do this alone." He looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed with fatigue, but steady, burning with resolve. "I have to, Mom," he replied. "If I don't do this, who will?" Angela blinked back tears. She nodded slowly, her voice catching in her throat. "Then show them what you've got." Now standing in the courtroom, Jordan felt the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, and every desperate hope that had brought him here. He turned to face Franklin Moore, the landlord's veteran attorney, with unshakable resolve. The courtroom was hushed, punctuated only by the quiet rustle of paper and the occasional cough. Jordan stood tall behind the defense table. Though his blazer hung awkwardly on his slender frame, his voice and presence carried surprising weight. His presentation had made people take notice. Even the judge seemed intrigued. But Moore wasn't about to be bested by a teenager. Rising slowly, Moore adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate suit and stepped toward the center of the room. Every movement oozed confidence, years of courtroom experience in full display. "Well, Mr. Carter," he began, his tone patronizing, "that was quite an impressive recital for someone with zero legal training. Truly commendable." A few chuckles echoed from the gallery. Moore let them linger, then opened a thick legal volume. "Let's see how well you really understand the law. Section 45 of the Landlord-Tenant Act clearly states that a landlord may issue an eviction notice if rent is unpaid for 2 consecutive months. So tell me, are you denying that your mother was late on rent?" Jordan paused. He knew this tactic. Distract, confuse, trap. But he stayed calm. "No, Mr. Moore," he said, his voice measured. "I'm not denying that payments were delayed. But I am here to prove that this eviction notice," he held it up for all to see, "was issued fraudulently." He turned toward the judge. "The signature on this notice belongs to Martha Allen, a notary public who retired 2 years before this document was dated. That makes the entire notice invalid, regardless of payment status." A ripple passed through the courtroom. Heads turned. Whispers rose. Moore's expression faltered. His eyes darted to the document, then back to Jordan. Recovering, he flipped a page in his book. Ah, but Section 52 of the same act, Moore countered, his tone sharper now, says procedural errors, such as clerical mistakes, do not invalidate an eviction when financial obligations haven't been met. Jordan didn't miss a beat. That's true, he replied, but only if a valid notice was served first. And this, he held up the notice again, is not valid. Fraud voids the process, period. Surely a seasoned attorney like yourself knows that. For a moment, the room froze. Moore's face tightened as he looked down, flipping through his notes with mounting frustration. The gallery, once amused, now murmured with approval. Even Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Well, Mr. Carter, Moore said at last, forcing a smile, you're certainly thorough, but this case is far from over. He returned to his seat, his expression a mix of irritation and reluctant respect. Jordan exhaled quietly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. The first battle was won, but the war was still ahead. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, Jordan began again, this is the eviction notice my family received. On the surface, it appears legitimate, but at the bottom, the notary signature belongs to Martha Allen, who, according to public records, retired 2 years before this document was signed. He handed over the evidence. This, he said, lifting another paper from his binder, is the official record of her notary certification and her state-filed retirement paperwork, confirming the date she stepped down. The signature is not only invalid, it's fraudulent, and under state law, that makes the eviction unlawful. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, scrutinizing the papers now passed to the clerk. His gaze sharpened. At the landlord's table, Moore shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, he interjected, voice strained, this is outrageous. How does this child even have this information? Jordan turned calmly toward him. I did my research, Mr. Moore. The law is public knowledge for anyone willing to study it. Moore opened his mouth to argue, but Jordan cut in. And even if my mother was behind on rent, the law requires a valid notice to initiate eviction. Without it, the entire proceeding is void. That's not an opinion. That's statute. The courtroom went still. No more smirks, no more chuckles. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, he said, his tone even, these are serious allegations. If the evidence holds, it could significantly impact this case. The court will recess to authenticate these documents. He banged the gavel once. As the judge exited, the tension in the room shifted. Jordan let out a slow breath, finally releasing the iron grip on his binder. He glanced behind him. Angela sat watching, her eyes glistening with pride. She gave him a nod, small but full of strength. You're not alone, it seemed to say. When court reconvened, the room was buzzing with restrained energy. Judge Reynolds returned to the bench, stone-faced. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the pages before him. At last he looked up. Mr. Carter, he said, the evidence you've submitted is compelling. But courtroom advocacy is more than presentation. I need to know you understand the implications of what you've brought forward. Jordan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Then answer me this. On what statute or precedent are you basing your claim that the eviction is invalid due to fraud? Jordan didn't hesitate. Section 58 of the State Tenant Protection Act, Your Honor, he said. It requires that eviction notices be notarized by a certified notary at the time of issuance. A forged or expired notary voids the entire process. That's reinforced by State v. Harper, 2008. The judge raised an eyebrow. And what about the claim that procedural errors don't invalidate an eviction? Jordan stood his ground. That only applies when the procedure is flawed, not when the entire foundation is illegal. Fraud isn't a procedural error. It's a deliberate violation. And according to the law, that makes the eviction not just unlawful, but null. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, studying Jordan for a long, quiet moment. And in that silence, for the first time since the ordeal began, a sense of momentum shifted in Jordan's favor. The system was listening. If the tenant has failed to meet their payment obligations, Judge Reynolds said, his voice calm but piercing, how do you reconcile that with your argument, Mr. Carter? Jordan took a measured breath, his mind sharpening under the pressure. Your Honor, he began, carefully choosing each word, That exact point was addressed in Franklin versus Rhodes, 2011. In that case, the court ruled that while tenants are indeed required to pay rent, landlords are equally bound by law to follow proper legal procedures. A failure to serve a valid notice, even when rent is owed, constitutes a procedural flaw that invalidates the eviction. The ruling made it clear, adherence to legal process is not optional. The judge narrowed his eyes, studying the young man before him. "Are you aware, Mr. Carter," he asked, "that if your argument is upheld, it could set a precedent, one that might shift how landlord-tenant disputes are handled across the state? There may be backlash, potential misuse. How do you propose we deal with that?" Jordan straightened, his voice steady but respectful. "Your Honor, I believe the law must apply equally, regardless of who is on either side. If this case exposes a loophole, it's not because the law failed, but because people stopped holding each other accountable. If a precedent is set today, let it be one that protects those without power, those without resources. The law should never be a weapon used against the vulnerable, and no one, no matter their wealth or influence, should be above it." The courtroom held its breath. Judge Reynolds leaned back, tapping his pen slowly against the bench, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Mr. Carter," he said, voice low but clear, "I've watched experienced attorneys falter under pressure in this courtroom. Yet here you stand, young, untrained, and completely in command of your case. What you've demonstrated today is extraordinary." A stunned silence filled the room. The judge's expression softened, his earlier skepticism replaced by something else: admiration. He adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly. "When you first walked into this courtroom," he continued, "I misjudged you. But today you reminded us all of something vital. Justice does not depend on age, background, or profession. It's upheld by truth and the courage to speak it. And you, Mr. Carter, have done exactly that." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The once dismissive spectators now sat in awe. A man in the second row, who had earlier scoffed, leaned forward and whispered, "Maybe I was wrong about him." An older woman wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "That boy," she murmured, "has more integrity than most men I've known." Even Franklin Moore, the seasoned attorney who had once smirked with confidence, sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched and hands folded tightly. He avoided the eyes of those around him, his bravado shattered by the weight of Jordan's case. Jordan stood tall, his fingers resting on his binder, no longer burdened by doubt or fear. For the first time, he wasn't just being heard, he was being respected. He turned to glance at his mother. Angela sat a few rows back, her hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She gave him a slight nod, full of pride, full of love. Judge Reynolds leaned in once more. "You've taught this courtroom something today, Mr. Carter. Not just about legal interpretation, but about resilience, dignity, and the power of preparation. I sincerely hope this is only the beginning of your journey." Jordan met the judge's gaze, his voice steady. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't forget this." The judge's lips curled into a faint smile. "You've earned this victory, son, and I suspect there will be many more in your future." Then, with a firm hand on the gavel, he brought it down. "The court rules in favor of the defendant, Angela Carter. The eviction notice is hereby declared invalid. The plaintiff is ordered to compensate the Carter family for wrongful eviction and emotional distress." The sound echoed like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a dam breaking, whispers surged through the gallery, followed by scattered applause. Angela gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands as she rose from her seat. She rushed to her son, wrapping him in a fierce embrace. "You did it," she whispered through her tears. "You really did it. You're my pride, my heart, my everything." Jordan held her close, his own eyes damp. "No, Mom," he murmured. "We did it. This victory is ours." As the courtroom began to clear, Judge Reynolds stepped down from the bench and approached them. His expression was thoughtful, a mix of humility and genuine admiration. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending a hand. Jordan shook it firmly, his heart still pounding with the weight of everything they had just overcome. "I owe you an apology. Jordan blinked, caught off guard by the judge's words. Still, he reached out and shook Judge Reynolds' hand with quiet confidence. When you first walked into this courtroom, Reynolds continued, his voice steady but laced with remorse, I assumed you didn't belong here. I let my own biases and assumptions cloud my judgment. But today, you proved me wrong. The judge's gaze held Jordan's. Justice doesn't care about age, race, or background. It cares about truth and courage. And you've shown both in extraordinary ways. Jordan nodded, his voice low but steady. Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot to me. Reynolds offered a faint but genuine smile, placing a hand gently on Jordan's shoulder. You have something rare, son. If you're serious about pursuing a future in law, I'd be honored to mentor you. This field, this world, needs people like you. Angela, standing nearby, pressed a hand to her chest, her expression full of pride and gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, emotion trembling in her voice.